Bungie have been killing it recently, and people are definitely talking about it. So today, let's jump in and talk about how the game is growing, how a post-Activision world is actually looking pretty good for players right now, and the huge opportunities that Bungie now have. They are doing a lot of big things that we've asked them to do for quite a long time, and I feel like it's pretty revealing as to some of the impact that Activision choices may have had on us, the players, over the past few years. A lot of players are excited about Destiny right now. Opulence has definitely delivered some of the best annual pass content by far, and Bungie have been kind of outlining their new plans for the future. Definitely a more player-friendly plan for content, and there are a lot of reasons for this, but the player base has been spiking over the past couple of weeks. We've seen way higher numbers than any other time in 2019 as far as we know, and I was going to ask the question, why? But I think it is pretty obvious. And one of the absolutely massive things for Destiny moving forward is that they're making the base game free. I feel like this probably would have never happened with Activision, although, as well as the split, the market is changing and Destiny isn't getting younger, so it does seem that they need a new plan, and it just so happens that this one could work greatly in Bungie's favor. We'll talk more about that, but also, no longer will we have to purchase DLC or even the base game in order to play actual new content. This is absolutely massive. And now that this has happened, it does become truly apparent how much of a kind of chokehold Activision had on this content. I mean, for a lot of you guys who watch regularly, you already play a bunch of Destiny, and you've already purchased a whole bunch of content, but just imagine if you wanted to return to Destiny, or if you were a new player, you would have to buy the base game, DLC, and Forsaken before you can get into the Year 2 or 3 game. And I'm sure Activision had a pretty significant influence over this. Going free to play, or the growth strat of not having to force players to buy a bunch of stuff they don't really want or need. As far as Activision were concerned, it probably was the riskier way to go. And I'd imagine with Activision, if the player base was declining, stuff like that would only get worse. And last year was a perfect example of this. They had it set up to where you needed Curse of Osiris and Warmind in order to play Forsaken. And in reality, that's just bonkers, isn't it? So definitely, thank you to Bungie for ditching this nonsense off, and hopefully it will mean that many new light players will then start to invest in paid content, right? Because Bungie do need to make money. There's nothing wrong with Bungie making money. The product just has to be good, right? And it kind of looks like we're getting that, or at least they're laying the foundations for that. It certainly feels like they're trying to build the best product and to create opportunities for players to play what they want and not to kind of drag people through old, frankly, less good content, right? Because going back to last year's example, making someone pay for Curse of Osiris in order to get Forsaken, in principle, is just crazy. And I feel like Activision were either encouraging or enforcing that, so we're in a much better place now. Also, over time, it became apparent that pumping out a new title every 2 or 3 years isn't really a comfortable fit for Bungie or Destiny, but it is precisely what Activision wanted to happen. From D1 going into D2, it was kind of normal to expect massive annual drops, and the expectation or assumption was that D3 would come within 2 or 3 years. And I think the reality is that for Bungie, to develop new titles with the kind of innovations and technical improvements that players actually want, while supporting the current game in a significant or meaningful way, to expect that much content and for all of it to actually be good is kind of horrendously unreasonable. So the biggest example of that for me was D2 Vanilla. We got big worlds, a fair amount of gear, a longer campaign, but the hit that the game took in terms of endgame progression, customization, even the tone of the game, it was absolutely huge. And to an extent, Bungie and Activision tried to turn Destiny into something other than what it was always supposed to be, and having to kind of produce this much content forced Bungie to lean away from what they'd been doing best. I feel like the biggest kind of failing on Bungie's part was probably allowing themselves to be put in that position, because Destiny is Bungie's vision, It's Bungie's innovation. If we're going to get good content, it's on Bungie to make it happen. And Activision are only about making any of that stuff happen if it means big money, right? In the end, Activision would prefer to pump out the fastest, easiest, and safest content that makes big money. And ultimately, I don't think that for that partnership specifically, it really didn't suit Destiny. Fortunately though, Bungie are now leaning back into the game that we wanted, They started with Forsaken, they did it throughout Year 1, Destiny 2 hasn't stopped growing at all, but now Bungie are leaning all the way into that direction because it's what works for Destiny. Mark Noseworthy said it, we're happy to stand on this corner and own it, and I think that's really what we want to hear right there. But how else is Destiny changing? Well, a big one is no more exclusive content. They've killed platform exclusives, and this is something that we've asked for a long time. And let's remember that exclusives can be a massive boon for Bungie with big launches. Previously they've gotten more major coverage for the game from Sony. But again, here is an example. It feels like at the first opportunity, despite the obvious kind of business benefits, Bungie have killed that deal because they know that it makes for a worse and a more kind of divided experience for players. So again, here I think we have to credit them for that. To a degree, exclusives can be ignored, I've always been an Xbox player, and a lot of the time, I'm not actually bothered all that much about the content, but in principle, it is removing stuff from the game on 2 of the platforms to make one of the platforms more appealing, and I've always kind of hated stuff like that. I remember back in the day, The Division launching content on Xbox weeks before on PS4 or PC. Anything like that feels like a really kind of trashy move, especially when you sit back and talk about community and stuff like that. Point being, Bungie aren't doing that stuff, and it's an amazing sign of respect for the players. And then you add to that cross-save, which is functionality that Bungie could have made work pretty much at any time in Destiny's lifecycle as far as I know. It appears that for business reasons that never happened, and once again, now that they have the opportunity, it's one of the first things they're making happen. So there are a lot of very consumer-focused things that are happening with Destiny. And then in Shadowkeep, we're getting system changes, new armor, mods, more heavy kind of RPG-style sandbox stuff, as well as progression. But otherwise, in terms of content for the moment, Bungie say that they have the whole team working on D2, more or less. And with more clarity about what content they're actually making, and without external expectations, from publishers, we've discussed all of that. Now, they can kind of align with what makes the most sense for Destiny and Bungie. And I feel like Bungie can improve the consistency of content for the next year or so. And as they say, they want to see how the next year goes, see what works for the players, see if the business is working for them as well, and then move from there. New Light, of course, presents a massive opportunity to get more players into the game and to eventually purchase new content. But outside of that, before we see anything else, it's hard to speculate in which ways Bungie will improve the game. And this is where a lot of people are going to ask for a lot of different things. Some players want PvP bringing back to life, the return of Trials, a Crucible endgame. Other players want to see strikes and new locations more often throughout the year. To some folks, there are technical things, we want 60 FPS on console. It's really difficult to round up everything that players ask for, but hopefully, being more content focused, and with a hopefully more manageable crunch for Bungie, we're going to see more parts of the game improve more often. And that's really what we want from Bungie now, isn't it? They've delivered great sounding plans, they're fixing some of the stuff that we don't like, so now, we need to see how the content transforms. Like the Moon and Shadowkeep, I do think that we're going to see more reworked D1 content, and for me, I believe personally that a lot of that stuff is pretty valuable. However, of course we do need new stuff, don't get me wrong, and I do understand the arguments around returning content, so I suppose ultimately it's about the experience and whether there is value there. But of course value can be pretty subjective. And so on the content front, we'll have to see how it goes, but I think certain changes to Eververse also shouldn't be ignored here. They have been reforming it. Partly, there is a more intense focus on silver purchases up front. And it's true that Bungie need to make some money, and think about it, new Light players can also go and buy stuff in Eververse, right? So it very much is a huge business opportunity, but they have made many other parts of Eververse more fair. One of the big things is that they've removed perks, purely so that we can have visual armor from Eververse. It's a pretty big move, and it does seem like the ultimate solution to Eververse gear having gameplay bonuses in the past, right? In a sandbox like Destiny, I don't think it was ever very fantastic to have bonuses that do affect gameplay and are purchasable on a piece of gear, right? So it's really good to see that they're going away, and who knows if Bungie or Activision kind of affected this. There are other things like Bright Dust being earned through gameplay, and a lot of it is stuff that we'll have to kind of get a feel for in the game, so to players, of course, there are pros and cons to Eververse, and hopefully with these changes and Bungie's kind of focus at the minute, they'll be doing it the right way moving forward. But for the future of Destiny as a franchise, and as a live game, there's a pretty interesting question of, will Destiny actually grow significantly? Of course, making the base game, and a very significant, chunk of the base game, as a free-to-play, will bring a lot of people on board. The main hope for Bungie is that as many players as possible will kind of engage with New Light, and actually discover Destiny through it. And once again, this is something they haven't been able to do with massive price tags kind of blocking people out. Considering that Destiny has had rocky press at times, right now, there are people that heard about what happened in Vanilla D2 and didn't really play the game, who assume that Destiny isn't a very good game, and I personally don't think that's true, right? I think it has a lot more potential than that. And so New Light has the opportunity to show that to people. And that's on top of the obvious benefits for currently engaged players or players who've kind of lapsed. And if it's a good product, then hopefully that means it's going to support Bungie with more sales and purchases of DLCs inside of this seasonal model. And if it works well, the other positive is that it continues to support future consumer-friendly practices from Bungie. So considering the turbulent turnover and how much work Bungie have had to do and how many decisions they've had to make very quickly, I mean, I'm sure they had some plans for this, but I think they've kicked off the conversation and they've announced their plans, and it feels like a really strong move from them. So personally, I mean, I'm slightly biased because I like Destiny. Obviously, I hope that this works out and is going to be fantastic for the game, the community in general, and I'd love to hear your thoughts below. One thing is for sure though, when you look at how many changes they're making to the base game, the way that content can be purchased, and Bungie say, removing barriers, and that's absolutely what it is, but really they also mean slightly anti-consumer nonsense, right? We always assumed that Activision was the source for a lot of that, and I think now it's pretty obvious that despite their pretty massive investment into Destiny, many elements of Destiny did suffer because of that misalignment between what Bungie wanted and what Activision wanted. I would love to hear your thoughts as always down in the comment section, guys, but if you've enjoyed the conversation, a rating is very much appreciated. If you're new to the channel and you want to keep up to date with everything related to Destiny 2, the news, the future of the game, guides, discussion, man, we talk about a lot of Destiny here, so hit subscribe if you feel like it. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you guys have an awesome day.